Welcome to the weekly CACOR webinar, CACOR Live. This week, it is my pleasure to introduce a colleague and a friend. David and I have known each other for almost 40 years and have gone through a lot together. When I think of David Harries, two words in particular come to mind. One is integrity. Sadly, it's a word that is applied to fewer people today than used to be the case. But David has far more than usual in men in our culture. The other is his intuition. David's intuition is almost off the scale. He'll demonstrate that today. He'll connect dots that you didn't know there were dots to connect. And so it's with great pleasure that I turn you over to a friend and a colleague and someone who is well worth listening carefully to. David, over to you.
Thank you, Ruben. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start by saying how pleased I am to be invited and allowed to give this message, because it comes from the heart. You see my slide here, and you notice David Harries in small letters WC. That's worried citizen. I am a worried citizen of Canada, which is the reason this project on Whence and Whither Canada's sovereignty was started 2 or 3 years ago and has grown. There are days I wonder if I have control over it, because every news day seems to bring something else up. Here's my narrative outline, and I start with the conclusion, which I will repeat, of course, as a conclusion. I start with a conclusion because with the way things are these days, you never know whether you're going to get finished what you start. Here's my premise. As the short bio on the first slide noted, I spent a lot of time in the military, either in operations or in professional development at colleges. And I am absolutely convinced, and all my experience tells me, and the state of the world today literally reinforces my belief that the ultimate responsibility of a national government is national security. Here's my conclusion. We are not in a good state. Here is the context for my presentation. Context today. We've all heard again and again about the global polycrisis, and whichever themes you choose to include in the polycrisis, perhaps the one that most worries me is that the polycrisis is very close to becoming a permacrisis, whether it's climate change, conflict, inequality, international crime, bad governance. There are many choices. Another context that is very new is NATO at 32 members. We've all heard the expression that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. It's my belief that the increase to 32 members of NATO is positive. But in terms of Canadian politics, it's a negative, because some of the new members their commitment to their primary national role puts Canada's performance in shade. Canadian public opinion, long not concerned with anything security-wise, has suddenly had a hiccup. And there are apparently more and more people who are worried about the state of our national defense and our sovereignty. Official opinion seems to be that the government continues to march on as if they're doing fine. I have been unable to find any agenda that shows that the retreats, and I think there are 3 of them going on now, 3 parties retreats, have foreign policy or defense policy on their agenda. I sometimes wonder whether the term party retreat is a good term. I emphasize here 2022 because this was, as my title there says, the inflection year. Until 2022, there was always some background noise about the state of the military, the state of the Department of National Defense, whether or not our diplomacy was good, bad, or indifferent. But in November of 2022, a retired 3-star general who had been awarded the Vimy Prize by the Canadian Defense Association Institute for, and I quote, significant, outstanding, and enduring contributions to the defense and security of the nation, in his presentation, spoke out against Canada's rejection of history, embrace of cancel culture, and the declining state of its military. He received a standing ovation that the moderator had to stop and ask people to sit down. That was followed in 2023 by what I call full court gloom. More and more people in and out of defense, diplomacy, the corporate world, and even, as I know because I'm a member of Canadian Pugwash, took to point out that things are getting worse and worse and worse. At the Department of National Defense, the relations between the military and the civilians grew more and more distant. And for the Canadian forces, I could not believe if any of you told me that you did not read some of the news about the terrible state of the Canadian forces. I am in Kingston, a military city. I see the problems every single day. The Canadian causes of that context in terms of Canada's sovereignty. That little title on top deserves my explanation. These are my 9 choices of 22 I've identified that happened since 1965. Why 1965? That was the year in May I graduated from the Royal Military College and was sent to England to do nuclear engineering studies because Canada had reached a tentative agreement with the United States, whose NASA were planning to use nuclear engines in space exploration. My 9 causes. Each of these are chosen because they had a direct, major impact on my life, my professional life, my personal life, and my financial life. That is why this list exists. 1968, unification and integration of DND. A stupid decision that no other country on earth has ever remotely considered following. The little green men in Donbass and Donetsk in the Ukraine were not the first little green men. Unification and integration put everybody in the military in the same green suit, gave everybody the same ranks, and reached so deep into ridiculousness that a naval marine engineer was given the command of an Army combat engineer regiment. But I could talk for hours on what that did. To me, it meant that my career was capped because combat engineers were removed from the combat arms so that there were many positions I was no longer eligible for. 1969, the 50% reduction in the Canadian forces deployed in NATO, in Germany by and large. Few people know, and probably fewer remember, that we came very, very close to leaving NATO, which is what Trudeau, P-E-T, wanted. But Leo Cadieux prevailed upon him not to go whole hog. And Trudeau did not want to lose Leo Cadieux as a colleague. This event changed my life because suddenly I was appointed the analyst for the Closeout Control Center for foreseeable in northern Germany. This meant, as a young captain, I was immensely powerful. I produced a 1,600 activity hurt chart. I traveled between London, Zost, where foreseeable was related, Lahr, where the Air Force was related, and the remnants of the foreseeable was sent, and Ottawa, where the computer was to do the card-based updates. I rotated for 18 months between those four places. Nobody could refuse my visit. And what came out of the update each time, they had to accept. I have no idea whether it made any difference, but it was chaos unlimited. 1980s, because of unification and integration, which we are still recovering from today, in the Army, regimental promotion patronage became the unspoken habit. The different regiments would share available positions for promotion and jobs. Then we had the shutting down of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. Most people remember it when it happened, finally, abruptly, when the Minister of National Defense took it off the order of battle in 1995. But it began in 1977, when the Chief of the Defense Staff, for reasons nobody understood at the time, removed the Canadian Airborne Regiment from Edmonton, a perfect location where it had all the support and resources it needed to be the vanguard for Canada's Arctic presence and defense, and moved it to Petawawa, Ontario, 5 hours from the nearest real airfield, from which the downfall truly began that led to its shutting down. I was a commanding officer in Edmonton of the Airborne Regiment. We had the most incredible equipment that could be airdropped or low altitude parachute extracted hundreds of kilometers into the Canadian Arctic. That doesn't exist today. I was also the deputy regimental commander of the whole regiment in Petawawa, where the toxic environment on a leg base meant that the members of the Airborne Regiment were hated by anybody not in it, and the Airborne Regiment returned the emotion. It was the downfall of any true integrity in the airborne. It was inevitable that it would go. Between 2006 and 2015, all federal Foresight offices, other than the tiny Policy Horizons Canada, were shut down. The people in power did not like ideas that they did not control. Looking forward was not seen as a benefit. I helped two of those offices in detail. We produced some quite interesting Foresight reports. They were ignored. In the 1990s, it became obvious that the reports from the National Defense College were not appreciated in DND and the Department of Foreign Affairs. Indeed, when we gave the reports, none of the people that listened to us had attended the National Defense College. In 1994, it and its small subsidiary course were shut down. It was shut down because it was called a boondoggle and because it was claimed that it was too expensive. The National Defense College was the best international think tank probably in the world. 44 senior executives, military, civilian, corporate, religion, fought to get on each course where they studied and traveled to as many as 18 countries a year to answer the question, what sort of policies for what sort of Canada in what sort of world? After the shutdown, for the next 3 or 4 years, the country was embarrassed by the performance of some senior officials who clearly did not know what they were talking about because they had never had an opportunity to attend a think tank like the National Defense College. So what is now called the Baby Generals course was established at Toronto's Canadian Forces College. I was a director, and then the director of curriculum, and then the deputy commandant of the National Defense College. It taught me more than every single academic or other military program I've ever taken. Some of you will remember the nuclear submarine program. This, of course, was a Navy program. But because I was a nuclear engineer and nobody in the military of any rank had any nuclear experience, I was ordered to join the program as, I never really got my title, an advisor or a colleague to a civilian seconded from Atomic Energy of Canada to be, in effect, the chief safety officer. The program was chaotic from the beginning. The French and the British played us perfectly. The British learned enough about us and the way we operate to succeed in selling us the submarines that have since become famous for their absence. 2022, because of a number of reports, the Canadian Forces introduced the Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion campaign. At RMC, that meant that you could see truly obese, very unkempt, painted hair, multiple tattoo people who clearly would not have been very good soldiers in a crisis. This past year, early this year, the freedom to be diverse, unequal, and included was reduced, so that now we have some rules on beards and tattoos and hair coloring and uniforms. We shall see where that goes. And lastly, federal officials' apathy, incompetence, delay, denials, deferrals, reductions, dishonesty, disdain, fears, and selfishness. But for me, 2022 was the great context contradiction. I ask you just to read the slide, what's on the slide. GOFOs, general officers and flag officers. So everybody above the rank of full colonel or naval captain. I still, after much searching, have not found a single one of the approximately 200 former GOFOs and ex-EXs who have taken any responsibility for the state that the Canadian forces are in. Consequences so far, because I chose 9 before, I chose 9 again. Of 22 that I've identified. Some of you may not be aware that the Canadian forces have a single peer-reviewed military journal. It's called the Military Journal. Early this year, it put out an edition in which there was not a single military article in it. Militaries around the world were astounded. The military career is no longer desirable. The number of officers that live in my neighborhood is 7. 4 are in the process of getting out. Trust, all-time low. Procurement, you could not have failed to read in the media, see on the television what procurement has become. And it is equally messy in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The Royal Military College, its future is under scrutiny again. In the 90s, it was under scrutiny because of anti-intellectualism. There were still generals in the middle 90s who used to joke that military time in school was military time wasted if it was after grade 9. Our international reputation is shrinking. We have been no-show and low-show at more and more major events. We are invisible in our own Arctic, even as virtually every aspect of its condition and context is becoming more and more demanding. And we are increasingly top-heavy. The only uniformed cohort of DND is fully staffed is those of general officers and flag officers. And again, you can't have not seen many of these words in the past months. But again, the people stating them, sometimes very loudly, sometimes very insistently, are speaking nonsense. We are not undefended. The US will defend Canada if Canada does not, because that's in its interests. We are neither irrelevant, nor insignificant, nor ignored, because the size of our country and its location, geographically and geopolitically, ensure Canada will be relevant and significant and not ignored, regardless of what we, Canada, does or does not do. Allies are not despairing because they know that despairing will not change anything. This especially since it was exposed in the United States that Trudeau had said at a NATO meeting that Canada will never meet the 2% target that it had promised to meet as far back as 2006. I do foresight, so I look especially hard at what is threatening. And these are some of them. The last one is of interest because I see our participation in the force in Latvia being a bit of a vulnerability. The Canadian Army is so short of people that its deployment up to the promised 2,000 members, which is just now being completed, those people will rotate in 2025. But who will follow them? And not only that, but if you have a deployment overseas, you need 3 groups of the same trained, same classification numbers. There are those that are there, there's those that were just there, and there were those that go next time. I also know that 2 commanding officers, majors of the group that are there, have already decided they will get out when they get home. Now, this is threatening consequences from an article that I'm awaiting clearance for in Europe. Everybody knows about NATO's Article 5. That is the one in which a NATO member commits to an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, notwithstanding the fact it's not very clear what that means in terms of action, it seems to be that if somebody bad attacks a NATO member, all NATO members will come to its assistance. But what is most disturbing is that NATO's Article 3 is being ignored by Canada. Article 3 states that every member will do all necessary to defend and protect their own country. The obvious reason being that so that it does not become a burden on the rest. We are becoming, as close as makes no difference, sovereignly undefendable. We do not have the people, the money, the commitment, or the support to defend our own sovereignty. We are well known as a liability for NATO because we are a country that could, but apparently won't, meet its commitments. If you look at where Canadians live, at our infrastructure, and even our plans, 50% of our national territory is in the North and the Arctic, where we aren't, but the US and the Russia and China have started a great game, and we have no control over the rules. International respect for Canada is down. And the Canadian Forces-wide crisis in personnel levels began well before the Minister of National Defense's famous death spiral announcement. When the fact that we were getting shorter and shorter in terms of establishment numbers was just not worried about. So the threat, undefendability as Canada's permanent status in the absence of a rapid revolution in defense common sense. Action These are ones I think we absolutely have to take. We got to cancel the impossible, unaffordable, illogical, obsolete, and delusional. Unaffordable. If we try to add up the trending costs of all that we have said we are going to do, whenever, we are closer to $1 trillion than we are to $1 billion. Many of those costs will go for things that by the time they are in the field, on the water, or in the air will be obsolete. And we are delusional in thinking that Canada, politically, socially, culturally, economically, and technologically, can produce a full-scale military structure akin to that of the United States or China or Russia. We have to stop pretending by promise. There are apparently more than 36 promises out there awaiting fulfillment. We need a national strategy that calls for a national military industrial policy. If you've seen some of the newspaper articles from the last 3 days on our ammunition situation and how we are gifting discarded, unarmed, decades-old rocket motors for Ukraine to cannibalize, you will understand exactly why we need a national military industrial policy. And we have to appoint competent officials and keep them in position long enough for them to have an effect and be friendly with the requirements of their jobs. Taking those actions produces certain demands. We need a National Security Council. Whether or not we follow the model that the USA has is just another case. But we need a place where the military, the diplomats, industry, and civil society can get together and discuss how we're going to work together instead of competing apart. We need a national audit office, such as the one the United Kingdom has, which is now watching carefully their National Defense Review. The Parliamentary Budget Office doesn't do the job. We need a national audit office. We need interoperable command and control and accountability. France has something akin to what I understand. It's not that we have to be the same. It's not that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, the Special Forces, Space Forces need to be the same. They have to be competent interoperably. We need a federal Foresight office so that the country can look ahead and be less surprised, more proactive, and stop being only reactive or a copycat. And we need, I got a lot of thinking to do on this, a federal procurement corporation. Because if we can't even spend the money we're gifted, allocated, there's no use pretending we can buy things when there are so many things we need. We have choices. We're very lucky. We're defended. We're a democratic country. We have choices. Nobody is attacking us right now except ourselves. We can continue to keep digging the hole. And for me, and the reason I'm a worried citizen is that's probably what's going to happen. We can change a bit. We can fix some of what isn't working. And some of that is entirely partly possible. Or we can restart things. We can create a 21st century Canadian Forces for Canada. And I am absolutely convinced that this is visionary and that we have a long way to go before either continuing or changing will give way to a real rethink. A restart. This is part of the study that I am doing with colleagues for this essay project. For the Navy, nuclear submarines, landing platform docks. Please, no more AOPS. A meaningful Coast Guard for inland, blue, and gray waters. Again, no more AOPS. You notice that I don't mention the 15 new destroyers. They will be obsolete before they're afloat, and we can't afford them. The Army, the infantry, engineers, land rail transport, and a much larger Joint Task Force 2. Urban armories, home to militia civil defense teams, and a skeleton that would be manned from A, B, C, D, and E as a command and control headquarters in a crisis, either a natural disaster or an industrial disaster in Canada. Air Force, light, medium, and heavy air transport, so that we can reach, be present in, supply, and help all parts of our country. Light, medium, and heavy helicopters, because they are a flexibility multiplier. And Space Command, because everything is becoming satellites and drones. And if we are to even be half compatible with the United States of America, we have to have a focal point for their Space Command to relate to. I say this in part because we no longer have a Canadian Space Agency. And then national and joint forces, a civil military relations headquarters to ensure that the civilian officials and the military officials and their corporate supporters are provided a place where they can work together, where they are required to work together. And then the usual joint capabilities, medical, legal, and procurement, and communications, other than, of course, specific Navy, Army, and Air Force tactical operations. Personal and human resources, and national development, which, if we are ever going to be serious about the North, let alone the Arctic, we have a massive amount to do. The last time we, and that includes everybody, was truly engaged in national development was in the middle 1970s. My airborne engineer unit built 3 Arctic airfields, and the engineers in the 80s built the Eagle River Bridge on the Dempster Highway, our only North to Arctic highway. My conclusion, again, and I finish with this invitation. Thank you.
David, if you will stop sharing your screen, then we can see your face and others. It's appropriate after the presentation you've just made that there be some silence, that we can let that sink in and catch our breath. Art will be up in a minute. I want to make a comment as in the role that I'm in, and ask you a question that do you have any sense as about the large scale background forces that are at play here? And let me give you just some examples of that. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it strikes me that the situation you've described over so many decades, that this is more than just the incompetence of a few people who happen to be badly appointed to a role. That what we're seeing is the disintegration of a capability of a country that, when you and I were born, had a reputation for being capable and competent and was respected. So something's going on here in addition to what you've described, or it seems to me. And I'm just wondering if you have any reflection on it. One of the things that, one of the places that is in the news today, given the work of Ian McGilchrist, is simply the degree to which the modern world has been shaped by the left hemisphere of the male brain. And that the absence of right hemisphere thinking, which is the contextual side, which is the soft side, which is the side we've assigned to women, but removed from official spaces, is that at play? Democracy is increasingly, we have politicians who in effect say, pretend to lead, but make sure that people understand you'll give them what they want. And regardless of the of what it is that they whatever they want. Anyway, let me stop there and give you a chance to comment, and then we'll call on Art.
I've been thinking about that throughout this project. Maybe some of my background thinking is we are very much a provincial country. We are not a country of provinces. Because of our constitution,
Did you hand me my shoes?
our size, our history, and layers of decisions that were more local than national, we have remained fragmented. In the 1960s, when I used to go from RMC or CMR, the French Military College where I started, out to the West Coast for my summer training, I would go by train. One train from Toronto. I would arrive on time. I would enjoy the trip. We are the only country whose constitution makes reference to the railway, because that convinced Western provinces to join. Today, it takes more than 2 days longer to take that trip by train. We have had fragmented oversight of defense, diplomacy, and industry, I think, ever since World War II. It has been a competition. We have had much made about us being, and the Prime Minister said this, a post-national state. We were truly a nation in World War II. We fought far above our population numbers. We contributed far above our population numbers, and we performed far above our population numbers. Now we have a much better, bigger population that is hugely multicultural, many cultural. The cultures are not coherently collaborative. It is almost, for me, impossible to imagine how, without a return to some common sense, we can create a situation with the type of government that we have now that will allow the country to perform as a country. So my answer is, we have never had collective, coherent oversight of all our parts. We are a country of, what is it now, 41 million Canadians. We're all aware of the very, very recent debate about visas and entry and who's here, and how easy it was to get here. And we were a national state, but we have allowed that to decay. So it isn't only one thing. It is all of us. We do not have a collective Canadian vision.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a note to end on. Art, if you would turn on your screen and ask your question, and Anita, you'll be up after Art.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I'd just like to indicate to everyone that I graduated RMC in 1963, attended the National Defense College, course 38 in 1984. And I still have connections into the Canadian Forces, at least through my group of 1963 graduates. Now, the implications of everything you've just said has greatly deteriorated the capability of the Canadian Forces to support the civil authority in times of, say, climate change emergencies. And the concept of various regions, making declarations that they're calling in the military, in fact, rather empty. And I don't know how the Canadian Forces, manage these things now. You might want to comment a little bit about that, about support to the civil authority. But I have really three particular units which I was aware of, and I'm not sure what the status is now, and that is the Inuit Rangers in the north, if they still exist. You did mention JDF2, and I'm glad to hear that they're still functional. And the third thing is, of course, Five Eyes, is that still something that the I know CSIS is involved potentially, but is the Canadian Forces involved in that in any way?
Sorry, what was the last one, Art?
Five Eyes
Yeah,
from the Second World War.
yeah. Okay, briefly, the Rangers still exist. More on that. JTF2 still exists. More on that. And Five Eyes still exists. More on that. The Rangers. They literally are our only eyes in the Arctic. But the Rangers live, each Ranger has a home. And if he is going to go anywhere, he needs a way to go somewhere. And the means that for going anywhere are all at our Northern Region headquarters, which is south of the Arctic Circle, Twin Otters, and a few helicopters. Helicopters with range that are insignificant in terms of the distances that have to be counted. So in terms of local presence and awareness, where the Rangers are and live, they are invaluable. But they are too few and too unsupported. And some of you may remember the stories about that we're still using World War II rifles. Took 20 years to get them new rifles. I honestly don't know whether they have their new rifles, but reinventing the wheel, those World War II rifles, my father had one, work pretty well when it's cold and don't rust easy. They're dependable. They don't break easy. My second Arctic parachute drop, my FN rifle, the following morning, I picked it up and I made the mistake of dropping it against a canister and the barrel broke. Okay. So we have long since not been good about knowing what works in the Arctic. There's been an article recently telling the forces to beware about their new predators in the Arctic, about they might not work very well when it's really cold, really windy, really dark. So Rangers, yes, they exist. Yes, where they are, they're incredibly valuable in terms of their knowledge of the climate. The apocryphal thing about there are 20 words for snow. And then down here in the South, we say it's either deep or shallow. It's another part of the world. JTF2, yes, they exist. Their numbers are small. They went through a mess when it was decided they were going to move to Mountain View in Quinte. They were going to open this huge new base. But suddenly the base turned out to be costing about $1 billion. And after expropriating all the land, kicking out all the farmers, it was canceled. So they're still on Dwyer Hill, just south of Ottawa, on a very small base. You can understand, I don't know anything about what they're actually doing, even though I have a couple of friends who are majors in the unit. The Five Eyes still exist. It's a very important intelligence sharing and relationship building organization. But you have to ask about the whole Five Eyes thing when you have a prime minister who, without telling his own country, tells his NATO colleagues he's not going to keep a promise. And then shortly after that, the US UK, Australia nuclear subcommitment happens and Canada wasn't even invited to the meetings. And I notice, frankly, the stupidity of the idea of a 12 non-nuclear submarine buy for the Arctic. I mean, that's the sentence. 12 non-nuclear submarines for the Arctic. Nobody in the Five Eyes has taken the time to tell us it's stupid. I guess because they don't have to. We even have people telling us that there's going to be subs on each coast and that they're going to go up and lie in the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic. A non-nuclear submarine? Anyway, so I don't know anymore how well the Five Eyes, how well four of the Five Eyes is looking at Canada.
Okay, thank you, David.
After Anita, Tom, you'll be up. So Anita, the floor is yours. Anitra.
Yes, I was going to ask something different, but on this day, which is 9/11, where we were attacked by a foreign power in our own country, and where last night showed what a horrible lack of political leadership we have fallen into on all sides of the aisle, and where we are being threatened by 3 wars simultaneously, which is unlike anything we have experienced since World War II, such as the Israeli Gaza, the potential Ukraine Russia war, and the potential whatever it is on East Asia, be it Rocket Man or China itself. I'm overwhelmed by what you say, having, like much of the American public, a fantasy that Canada is our staunch ally, as they were in World War II, and standing there with our back, having our back. So I am wondering if these scenarios should play out with a triple war and with our many, many trillions of dollar debt, how you would play forward the US if you were invaded at that point by Putin, who of course thinks anybody who has a border, and you have a border called the Arctic Sea in common with Russia. You and he are the longest bordering states. What would happen if we were diverted by the triple war, by our budget, and by our obviously very poor lack of any kind of leadership on any side of the aisle?
Whoa. We could not help. Because we just don't have the people. Our establishment is not large. When I first went to Germany, just before I became the closeout control center analyst, I think our numbers were about 130,000. And now, total establishment with militias and reserves and so on is under 100. And the regular force and the forces are 15 or 16,000 short, and the numbers going up, i.e., the shortage is going up. If there was a sudden crisis, it would be truly chaotic. I have significant faith in the ethics and the commitment of the armed forces of the United States of America, because they have an interoperable command and control and accountability office. It's called the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is the head guy, girl, right now, a guy. We have nothing like that. And their commitment to country is, in my view, rock solid. But they and the politicians, 22 members of the government wrote to our prime minister telling us to get real about defense. Prime minister didn't send them a letter back because he doesn't have an answer. 2 of your generals have already stated that they're going to be exercising in northern Canada. They didn't say how many Canadians would be with them, but they said that they needed to train their forces, i.e. American Army Special Forces, in Arctic warfare. The Americans have a massive capability in Alaska. It is truly massive. It's until you see it, and I haven't seen it now for 8 years, it's massive. And I am quite sure if America was stressed overseas, regardless of your leadership, there would be a higher emphasis on, how will I put it, homeland security, which includes Alaska. And the front line against the Russia and China stitch up in the Arctic is and will be from Alaska. We won't get submarines, if ever, for decades. The Arctic operation patrol ships are virtually unarmed and can only operate in the Arctic 3 or 4 months a year. In fact, something that nobody thought about before, they said, oh, the Arctic's fine. The ice is going. Yes, but when the ice goes, it doesn't completely melt. And there are chunks of ice there that are now free to be blown about. It's like being in a bumper car zone. So our AOPs are unsuitable except for a very short period of time in the Arctic. And I don't know, some of you may have read how the latest deployment of an Arctic operations patrol ship was to Havana, which doesn't seem very Arctic. So the good news is I'm confident in the capabilities of the command and control of your national defense. There's nothing to do with finances. I mean, the Pentagon hasn't passed an audit ever. Ever. I don't know how detailed that would be, but we certainly wouldn't. So one of the reasons I'm a worried citizen is that I always believed that we were a continental partner with the United States, and our ability to be a partner in other than lofty sounding promises doesn't exist anymore. But
the kicker here is the back of the American taxpayer, who has to put up with this enormous amount of corrupt waste in the military, and who has grown totally disenchanted with government, with military, and with the enormous amount of debt being driven by the legislators that we have voted into office, who are showing themselves so mismanaging things. That's the kicker, is the American taxpayer here.
No, I hear you. I understand. America has 800 bases. Every single base costs money. Maintenance, operations, 800 bases. And if I may, the biggest war the United States is fighting is literally within the Pentagon. It's called the budget war. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, Space Command, the Coast Guard fight for budget. And of course, they are backed up because of your massive military-industrial complex by the senators and representatives from the states that provide the people in the places that support the budget wars. So that's, I don't know what to call it. That is bad news. But given that you have the most advanced military and paramilitary system on Earth, I go to bed at night thinking, well, at least the people that are leading that military behemoth are by and large well-intentioned. And if they weren't, we in Canada would be really in a hole. So I don't have any good news except to say that at the very least, you're starting from a very, very high point. Whereas here in Canada, we're in a very, very deep hole. We don't have a whole bunch of bases where we should have bases. You have a whole bunch of bases that you could withdraw from very, very quickly and come home and defend your country and the continent.
Hey, I'm
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, if you're there, thank you. And I'm going to ask, make Samrat's comment afterwards. And then Michael Marion, you'll be up after I make Samrat's comment and David responds to it. Tom.
Hey, thank you, Ruben. For some of the longer serving members of CACOR, you may know me as Dave, which is my middle name. And I'm using Tom here because we're speaking to Dave. I want to make a very quick observation regarding the discussion with Anitra a moment ago, which is that if you think the American military-industrial complex is extremely expensive for American taxpayers under the control of the American government system, complex as it is, wait till you see how expensive it'll be under Putin's thumb. My gosh, you cannot possibly imagine. Here's my first question. I have several others, and I'm going to get back to them, I hope, if there's time. Would it be appropriate to have large hovercraft? Could they be useful in the Arctic? Now, I know that the U.S. Marines have a hovercraft that's big enough to carry, I think it's 2 M1 Abram tanks.
Yes.
So they've got some pretty big ones. We don't necessarily need them that size, but you can essentially buy them off the shelf. And I think you could deploy them in the Arctic in a wide variety of circumstances, and they would be extremely helpful.
Yes, useful, but they need a support base. And the reason in my restart numbers for the Navy, the landing platform dock, have you ever seen a picture of one of these things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here is a boat that can carry a massive amount of things and people and park, and they live there, and it is self-supporting in many ways.
Yep.
So if they were equipped with, tactical hovercraft, that might be an idea.
Yeah. I tried to get that into national defense a number of years ago, went nowhere.
Yeah. How about the other suggestion that was made about 15 years ago for airships?
Mhm. I suggested that in my, not to defense, but I
Yeah.
suggested that we should be using dirigibles in my
No,
master's.
for national development,
40 years.
delivery.
Yeah,
shipment.
exactly.
Yeah. So
By the way, the Americans just sank a suitable ship for that purpose with a new missile. They just sank it.
yeah. um, the hovercraft will be vulnerable. My first experience with a hovercraft was crossing the British Channel
Yeah.
with my parents' car.
Mhm.
Wow. That's a long time ago.
Yep.
But with this new ice condition in the Arctic on the shoulders of the winter, unless they create some incredible skirt for the hovercraft,
Mhm.
I don't know, Kevlar reinforced or something like that, that skirt will be torn.
Yeah, I think they already have that with those hovercraft the Marines use.
Yeah, but every time somebody says marine and hovercraft and landing craft and so on, I think of amphibious landings and sunny weather. Yeah, in the south. Our experience with the Marines in the Arctic, it's a long time ago, but some of them accompanied us when we were dropping our bulldozer and grader and pulver mixer in the Arctic, because they wanted to look for amphibious operations at small, heavy equipments, which these were. They over-depended on technology and not on common sense. Same as the old NATO North Flank exercises. The Americans would come with 2 rucksacks full of stuff that no human being could carry. So they had to go everywhere by vehicle, which of course means you couldn't leave the roads, which means you couldn't go to places where there were the operations. So
Last time I looked, there weren't very many roads in the Arctic.
All right, I'm going to get into this. So because I want to get as many questions as we can. Samrat is no longer with us, but he made a comment, David, that I'd be interested in your
yeah,
view on. His comment is militarism and military never solved any of the real problems human beings face yesterday or today.
let me stand back from the statement and focus on the word solve. In my view, and the people in WAS and a project that the World Academy is involved in know this well, you never solve a big complex problem. By the time you think you're well into it, the problem has changed. And if ever you solved a major complex problem, all the things you had to do to solve it would create others. My focus is on progress. So I don't disagree, but had there not been a military forever, there would have been wars, threats, problems that would have been worse without them. People say, well, let's do peacekeeping. Well, I've been in 3 war zone peacekeeping missions, and none of them worked very well, but they worked as well as they could. And that was military. And I was in NATO for 2 years before I got made a closeout control center analyst. And the military didn't work very well, but apparently we won the Cold War. So I don't talk to me about solutions about complex problems.
Thank you. And now your friend and colleague, Michael Marion.
Michael,
Yes, David.
go.
I wrote out the question. Okay. Well, you know, it looks like the Canadian military is very far down. And what are the costs of a restart versus the costs of territorial incursion, whatever that might mean? You try some different scenarios. So what?
No, no, it's a fair question. And I have no idea about the costs. I mean, there are so many campaigns about cutting costs. It's like the peace communities campaign, move the nuclear weapons money.
Right?
So I have written a couple of articles and been pilloried for them saying, well, move which money? And of course, there's no accurate numbers for everybody's nuclear weapons budgets because nobody likes saying things like that. And I say, okay, let's say we get a pile of money. Where are we going to move it to? And who are we going to move it to? And how is that going to be overseen and so on? So territorial incursions versus so what? How about next year, one of these major cruise ships that are booked to go through the Arctic hits an iceberg and sinks. And Canada has to, it's in Canada. But we haven't got anything that can do that. So we got to call. Who will we call? The Russians? The Chinese? If the one American major icebreaker is available, maybe the Americans. But there's a whole thing back to this national state thing. We have to be reasonably able to defend our sovereignty. And if every time there's a crisis in a place that we just don't want to occupy, that somebody else has got to help us with, that doesn't seem to be very sovereign.
That doesn't quite answer the question. I'm sorry. I mean, you can have Trump and Harris evading certain questions like last night, but no, directly. I mean, do you really need the very far reaches of the Arctic? So what? And do you need a very elaborate military that you have? And why not just shrink it down to a National Guard for disasters and use the money for other things like refurbishing their infrastructure and the railroads?
Because we don't have the means at present to get a whole bunch of people to more than 50% of our country. And if that's not military, it's civilian. But what civilian organization is going to just do nonprofit waiting for the natural disaster? We are a big country. If we can't go there and be present and respond, we're not national. We don't have any sovereignty. And the last time that the Chinese icebreaker went through, there were days when, my understanding, we didn't even know where it was. So part of being a country is being a whole country. I mean, is this not part of the issue with Ukraine? According to people like Trump and so on, if Ukraine was willing to give up 2 parts of its country, we could have peace tomorrow. But they don't want to give up 2 parts of their country, and they're fighting for it. This is not only about fighting, but we all know, I think we all know, that the Arctic region is very rich in resources.
Ah,
And everybody wants resources. And so are we going to allow the Chinese and the Russians to explore for resources where we aren't?
okay. So there's a cost of giving up the resources to other nations. Otherwise, the analogy with the Ukraine doesn't work very well because the Ukraine is adjacent to Russia, and Russia thinks it's
Oh, but
wants to
we're
be great
adjacent
again.
to
And
Russia. We have barriers with Russia.
you what?
In the Arctic, we have borders with Russia. In
I
the Arctic.
understand that, but so what? Are those borders populated?
I'm going to butt in here. Having been present at these two engaging with each other, that's been helpful. Michael, you've put issues on the table, but we're short of time. And I'm going to move on to Ted.
Okay, we'll leave it there on the table.
Monroe, you'll be up after Ted.
Well, thank you very much, David. It's very stimulating to hear you. It's deja vu all over again, but if you just substitute the defense for environment, the government used to do strategic planning with regard to the environment. We had groups who actually did research on it. We had groups studying the specifics, the issues and so on, but that has really been going away. So in some ways, this is a generic complaint about governance for Canada. It strikes me that that has happened in so many different places. So what I'm really saying is, has Canada ever clearly defined the challenges that has to be responded to by, I say I tried it in environment, by security? Can we put a case in front of Canadians saying what we should be taking on, which risks are we prepared to do, how much money, how much people, how much whatever does it in fact take to do this? I remember doing it for the Canadian Coast Guard 15 years ago on essentially a visioning exercise for a long period of time. And they essentially were looking at what they could do, and they were really totally opposed to talking about sharing ships, sharing staff. They saw themselves as a totally different entity. In fact, they didn't even want their people armed, because they go up when they approach a fishing boat. They don't want anybody to even think they're armed. So it was definitely an issue of trying to say, really, what should we have? What should we do? What risks should we spend money to try and be able to take care of? So it's easy to raise the question, but I think now that we have largely eradicated any capacity to advise government in any sensitive way on almost every risk-related issue I can think of. So that's more an observation. Is that right then when it comes to defense? Is it a unique, or is it just one of the current policy of government to ignore everything it doesn't like?
Well, I like that statement. Ignore everything it doesn't like. I mean, that was literally why NDC was shut down. The business about deja vu. One of the annual operations us guys in the airborne had each year out of Edmonton was to get in a couple or three Buffalo aircraft and go north and do ice surveys for the Department of the Environment. Now, we know how to drill holes in the ice, and we know how to measure it to make sure the plane could land safely and everything like that. But we didn't know anything about the results of our surveys. We were helping those people. So
I used you when I was running part of the Canada Land Inventory, and yes, thank you.
We don't do any of that anymore. And that's this business. We need a national strategy. And I said in my slide, the national military industrial thing, but it's whole of government instead of holes, HOLES, of government.
So is Canada therefore going to put out any effort whatsoever if somebody borrows an island in the north? Or will we just ignore them and hope it goes away?
Well, I suggest it depends on who takes the island. I mean, remember the Polar Star? What year was that? 75?
Yeah.
And what? We agreed to disagree. I'm wondering if that will happen when the Chinese do it.
Yeah, and the other one is, can we mobilize Canadians to protect their sovereignty, or can't we? Or is it cheaper to let them have it and to take something have them send some more goods to us via Walmart in return.
Well, yeah, at point taken. I agree. So,
Mhm.
but we don't have a national strategy. And
Yeah.
the last 3 defense policies have all been pretend promises.
Mhm.
And we're still waiting for the next one. And we haven't had a real foreign policy, which should come before a defense policy, if we're sensible, hasn't happened since 2013. But we've now got this pragmatic diplomacy initiative. And yeah, we need a strategy for the country. And this is not about strategic planning, because we don't have a strategy to plan against yet.
Thank you very much, David. Exactly what I thought you'd say, and thank you.
Rick Monroe. And then Richard, you'll have the last question. So Rick, you've got the second last question.
Okay, thank you. It actually follows quite nicely from what Ted just said. And David, it gets back to your point about foresight and what you referred to as the closure of the foresight offices. I'm not quite sure what that means, but what I'm getting at is whatever research is being done, or as far as I can see, there isn't much being done out of the military, at least not that's publicly available, from the military security analyst sector. When I compare it with the research that came out about 15 years ago, even more than that, with respect to long-term oil supply and the issue of peak oil and so on, I've really searched the same sources that provided so much information back then. The word foresight was used quite often. I believe, like here in Canada, I think was called FSE, the Future Security Environment. I think there were a few publications of that. In the States, we had the JOE, the Joint Operating Environment. DCDC had its futures analysis team, sort of looking down the road, and it was all publicly available, and it did address issues like long-term oil supply and environmental concerns and climate change and mass migrations and so on. But I've seen, to get to the point, I've seen very little from Canadian military security analysts other than a very strong focus on the Arctic. And I'm just wondering whether I've missed something. And also the second part of that is getting back to Ted's point, what capacity does our government have, including our military, for analysis of risks? The lead department, as far as I can see right now, is no longer DND, at least not in terms of stuff that's publicly available to people who are interested like me, but rather it's Policy Horizons Canada. And I'm involved now with an exchange of information with them, but I certainly am not seeing what I expected to see with respect to the effects on domestic security with respect to the poly crisis, climate change in particular. We have a farm. I'm quite involved with farm issues, food security, those sorts of issues. So I'll turn it back to you. The question is, what's going on with that sort of foresight research?
Well, first of all, I agree with your assessment. I don't think anything's going on. And I see 3 reasons for that. One that has upset me since the stupid move of the airborne regiment from Edmonton to Petawawa, leaving alone the fact it was cut in half and everything like that. That was done for personal, senior, official reasons, and there was no foresight on the consequences, which were, for us in it, it was obvious. Analysis of risk. One of the problems today in the world at large, in my view, is that experts are one of the obstacles to progress. Experts don't like to do foresight because they're going to see things or be given insights on things they aren't expert in. And that will, first of all, make them uncomfortable. And secondly, make them less expert than they were in the field. as for analysis of risk in the Canadian government right now, I think the biggest analysis of risk operation is the analysis of the success of risk averseness. They will do anything to avoid, to not risk embarrassment, not risk being caught out, not risk saying something that they're going to have to live up to sort of in real time. In 2032, if we all make it that far, when Canada reaches 2% of GNP on defense, the risks are going to be incredible because of the consequences of a promise like that. The foresight that was done in the past, I was involved for a considerable amount of time with Policy Horizons Canada. In fact, two people that are senior analysts there now were people that I and others helped grow into the business of foresight. Once we had the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, and then that was shut down because the National Security Advisor did foresight exercises, some of which I took part in. Reuben took part in one of them. Gone. Policy Horizons Canada doesn't do security. And one of the reasons for that is, shall I say, collective risk averseness. As you almost certainly know, it's sort of managed by a consortium of deputy ministers who the committee that takes care of it or oversees Policy Horizons Canada. They don't want to get within 10 feet of a security issue at Policy Horizons Canada. And I have a feeling that defense is quite happy with that distance. So in big answer to your question, I don't think any real foresight is being done. The military does war games, but the war games by and large are about change, not about potentials, plausible contingencies, and so on. And again, I am really down on experts. Sorry, a terrible answer.
No, it's not a terrible answer. It's a discouraging answer, but it certainly fits with everything I've observed, and I've spent a good deal of time searching for stuff. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you both. Richard, you have the last question.
Thank you. Thank you, Reuben. David, you've outlined very well what perhaps the military needs to do. The problem, as I see it, is one of competing priorities. If you're a federal finance minister, and then you are faced then with the question of where are you going to spend your money? Is it best spent on healthcare, for instance, or are you going to spend it on the military? With the likelihood of any upcoming military conflict being much smaller, like there's ongoing risk to health every day to every Canadian, but not of military conflict. So that's one of the things you have to think about when you're finance minister. And that's why I would ask you, where would you put your money? If you have a limited amount of money, would you put it on the military or would you put it in healthcare?
Richard, I'll answer your question after we have a national strategy.
Yeah.
And that's not a cop-out. As I said very early on, we're a very lucky country. It'd be really, really hard for somebody to invade us. But arguably, we've already been invaded. You've no doubt seen the news about there are 900 war criminals in Canada. You've seen the latest news about these guys that were allowed in on student visas that were well before they got their student visa, not very nice people. We have, especially with our administration at national headquarters, C Phoenix Pay System, among other things, we aren't very efficient at knowing and doing. And our threat is within. As I say, we don't have a national strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Without a national strategy, we can't have an Arctic strategy. Without an Arctic strategy, we can't have a military strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a finance minister, tough job. I wish the finance minister was an economist, but that's beside the point.
Mm-hmm.
Where will we put our money? Well, what does Canada want? Well, what is Canada's strategy? We're throwing our arms up in the fog. I mean, this is not the fog of war, luckily. This is the fog of we don't have any direction. Well, we have every direction. Well, who's in charge? I mean, Harlan Cleveland wrote this great book, Nobody in Charge, back in, I can't remember, 59 or something like this. It's a great book. You could change a bunch of names and dates, and it's today.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, what with the likes of internet and artificial intelligence, everybody's in charge now. You want to make a statement that's right out of the blue? Send it out.
Yeah, I would argue that you need healthy Canadians in order to be productive. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But healthy Canadians in which province?
All across the country.
Yeah, I agree. But we are the country. We're 12 different health systems.
Yeah, I agree. That's unfortunately true.
And not only 12 different health systems, but a gazillion different education systems.
Mm-hmm.
Because of our Constitution. So I don't think we're going to change our Constitution, but we have to find a way. This word Canadian Citizen says, to create a national strategy that deals with what is important for Canada,
Mm-hmm.
so it can be important for Canadians, all Canadians.
Yeah.
Have to start with that national strategy. Or else, again, we're just flailing in the fog.
And on that note, flailing in the fog, I'm going to draw this to a close. I want to thank all those who asked questions. Let me personally thank you, David, although Ted will, on behalf of all of us, do that in a moment. You said when you started you would speak from the heart, and you did, but you brought your whole life and your mind and your body to it. And for that, I am thankful. Ted, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ruben. David, that was wonderful. We noticed you got everybody arguing, and that's really what we try to do here. I agree with you completely, by the way, that if we don't have a strategy, if we don't actually define what we want, what we consider to be an improvement or well-being, otherwise we just go to every Canadian and they all have a full consensus. Each of them says, I want it all and I want it now. And regrettably, we have not been much better at trying to create something strategic that actually identifies the interventions, whether it's military or environmental or economic. So thank you again for this very wonderful presentation. We will definitely be talking to you again because this is worth pursuing further. And the whole idea of what a place like CACOR can do to foster some kind of consensus or at least discussion on what Canada's strategy should be and what the priorities should be is probably worth doing in future. Anyway, on that note, thank you all very much for coming. If you wish to watch this, it will be on very soon. It will be available, then please share it. Please, if you do go on to the YouTube and send it to other people, please subscribe. And very shortly, we are going to be using Wild Apricot to give you a chance to manage your own membership and to make sure that those of you who may have forgotten to pay get a chance to do that. So telling you then, there's the commercial. So thank you very much for coming, and we will now turn off recording, and we will